You can Google him. He was a key guy at PayPal, has been an entrepreneur most of his life, has helped lots of other companies.
Who doesn't know Dave?
Does anyone know Dave? I mean, I don't mean personally. Wow. Dave, look at you.
Okay.
Dave McClure, everybody.
Thanks. Can you guys all hear me? People in the back? Great. So I have 20 minutes to go through 26 slides. That math doesn't really work, but if I don't suck at the end when they try and pull me off stage, you guys tell them no and start clapping, and then I'll get an extra 5 or 10 minutes. See, I'm telling you right now. And I'll try not to suck. So I'm going to talk about changes in the venture capital market, mostly my experience in Silicon Valley, but I think actually it's a story that's not just in Silicon Valley, but also in other places, and portends well for places like Vancouver and other areas around the world. So we'll talk mainly about 3 things. Changes in venture capital, why platforms are important, and more particularly in the last 5 years, some platforms that have come of note, particularly search, social, and mobile. And I'll talk a little bit about my experience running an incubator program, the Facebook incubator program last year, and the one that we're working on hopefully sometime later this fall or early next year that we'll get started. So, the headline on a lot of this stuff is the death of large funds and the birth of these super angel funds. Several of us here, probably involved in running funds that are $10 to $50 million in size. Large funds, what I'm typically saying right now is venture capital funds that are about $250 million or larger. And I'll explain a little bit about why I think that's challenging, at least for consumer internet businesses. So it's the general I'm going to talk about. So quick commercial, I started a fund a couple weeks ago. I started out as a geek and a crappy entrepreneur. I was an okay marketer at PayPal, did a decent job at Simply Hired and at Mint, although I was really just part-time at Mint. Started investing when I left PayPal on a relatively small sum. Mint was one of the better choices that I made. And then I worked at Founders Fund running their early stage program last year and was pretty active there on a small budget. So in about a 15-month period, I did 43 deals on less than $3 million in capital. Those were in 2 programs. One was an incubator program, sort of around the Facebook platform, although more around Facebook Connect than on platform itself. We did 22 investments, also 2 nonprofits as well that we didn't put money into. And that was a 3-month program. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but we had a relatively large number of small investments, short period of time. Most of them didn't work. A few worked. In particular, Webfire is doing very well right now. I also ran a program that was a seed stage program, about $100,000 average investment. We did 21 deals out of that. Most of those companies were raising $500,000 to $1 million, so we weren't the lead in most of those investments. Usually we were just a participant. So even though I was working for a relatively large venture capital fund, I was sort of acting as an angel, very active angel, although some folks in the Valley, Jeff Cleary, Ivan Sencut, and Ron Conway, probably even more active than that. So before I had joined Founders Fund, I'd done 13 personal investments over about a 4-year period on about $300,000. More recently, in the last year, I did another 13 investments on another $100,000. So pretty small investments. And the story with venture capital is the story with startups mostly, which is it's mostly about fail and you get a few wins. So Mint is the singular success that I would say I can point to out of investing in over 60 companies in the past 5 or 6 years. Those dates don't really work very well. Ivan's got a better track record on exits than I do by far. But one thing I started noticing, so first of all, it actually does take a fairly long time for a lot of investments. Mint was a relatively quick one that happened in about 3 years. But some of the other companies that I think are doing well, I invested in more than 3 years ago, still, are private companies. And I'm not going to talk too much about the new program we're getting going, except to say that I think there's an interesting model in taking incubation and seed investments to the next level, doing a lot of them, expecting a lot of them will fail, doing incremental investment, and then specifically combining some other areas that you don't normally think about in technology investing, design and distribution being the 2 things that I think really most technology startups don't think about very much. Metrics, that's sort of changing a little bit with the lean startup movement over the last 2 or 3 years now. I think more people are thinking about it, or at least talking about it. What I will say is been working on a lot of companies that I wanted to start with this fund once we get off the ground. We've done 30 investments really in the last 2 weeks, although I've been working on those in the past 6 to 8 months. So I'm putting my money where my mouth is. I am planning to do a lot of investments, small investments. I'm very happy with the companies. I'm so happy with my Gengo, I invested in them twice, according to that slide. So what's going on with venture capital? And I guess most of my conversation is going to be constrained to consumer investing, so some of these ideas don't necessarily apply to other more capital-intensive areas. But so I think that that's a picture of Ron Conway there. He's probably been the most prolific angel investor in the Valley for, I don't know, at least 10 or 15 years now, maybe more than that. Ron has probably invested in more companies that I have even talked to for pitches. Some people might say that's a bad thing. I do think that there's actually a lot of interesting data that Ron has access to that might suggest otherwise. But as much as there's a story about, like, super angels competing with large venture capital, and even, I talk about the death of venture capital and dinosaurs, really the story is one more of partnership and syndication than direct competition, although there's definitely a lot of competition going on as well. So this is sort of an example of how I think, you're starting to see startups get financed in the Valley and potentially in other areas, which is you have people working at incubation or angels with relatively small amounts of capital developing product ideas. Once those product ideas look like they've got a little bit of, like, of their act together, then angels and seed investors start helping them develop marketing and distribution and working on that. As that sort of develops a little bit more, we have slightly larger funds that think there maybe are larger market opportunities, and then the biggest of the funds. And they can certainly all jump in at smaller levels, but it's more difficult for the larger operators further down to operate efficiently at the top levels for a couple of reasons that I'll get into. Originally, venture capital was really developed for relatively expensive product development and somewhat long cycle time in both product development and customer acquisition. So 20, 30 years ago, maybe even longer, venture capital was building big iron, large mainframe computers, building hard drives, building enterprise software companies, started to change and getting into life sciences, medical devices. So most of those things are relatively expensive. I mean the product is expensive. I mean the product development life cycle might be multiple tens of millions of dollars or more, and it takes years to do that. So what's not typically used for venture capital is small business or cash-intensive businesses. So porn and gambling is at the bottom, not necessarily relevant for venture capital because you don't need to. You've got plenty of money from those businesses if you want to do those businesses. And the interesting story is kind of these larger internet companies. Facebook, Zynga, Groupon obviously have taken a ton of venture capital. So people might challenge me and say, well, some of the most commonly known examples of success in venture capital in the internet used a ton of venture capital. What are you talking about, Dave? And those are the exceptions, and life is great for you if you happen to be an investor in one of those companies, but that's typically not what's going on in the Valley these days. So some of those changes happened at least maybe 10 or 15 years ago. Internet browsers started coming around 93, 94. The original Web 1.0 companies started coming around 95, 96. So eBay, Amazon, Yahoo, others. Really a lot of the distribution opportunities started happening really almost 15 years ago. But we weren't seeing a lot of things that have happened in the last 5 or 10 years with mainstream user adoption until more recently. So you started to see a lot of people, not just early adopters, use the web maybe around the early 2000 timeframe. Email became more common at that time. Browsers became more widespread. Bandwidth started increasing. The other things going on was that those initial companies got fairly large, and aside from the fact there was a ton of upheaval around 2000 to 2002, most of those things sort of shook out by 2003 to 2005. We then had these large internet companies that were pretty, okay. I mean, I have criticisms of eBay and Yahoo, but they generate billions of dollars. They have many hundreds of millions of users, and they're cash flow generating machines. They're not great innovators. And I think that's just a classic story is companies get big, they focus on a customer and a channel, and they tend not to be good at innovating outside their core business area or even sometimes in their core business area. And so what happens is they tend to start outsourcing innovation, and by that I mean buying companies, right? So the M&A story, at least last 5 to 10 years, has largely been about Microsoft, Yahoo, eBay, Google buying companies, and relatively reasonable pace, 10 to 20 companies a year, maybe in some cases. So they have lots of users, they have lots of money, they don't have a lot of innovation, they want to buy companies. Great, they can do that. So what's happening in the retail side of the market, IPOs, is many of those reasons why Sarbanes Act and other things are like slowing down the IPO market, but I don't really think that's the key story. What's happening is these early 1.0 web companies have gotten to a large enough size that when they see interesting things happening in the market, they don't let it get big enough to go IPO. But so it's the bigger exception that's like a LinkedIn or a Facebook, and in most cases probably they've even had multiple offers, and maybe Facebook would have gotten bought by Yahoo and a couple of other players with the challenge of a few things not happening. So in many cases, success stories that are happening are getting bought earlier because there are already these large companies out there that want to buy technology, that want to buy innovation, and are not letting the best and the brightest actually grow to the point where they might actually be IPO, unless their founders are just totally psycho and think that they're going to conquer the world, and in a few cases, maybe they are. And I think the more classic story is Mint, which is a company that I was an investor for, did a little advising and consulting for. And Mint was acquired for $170 million by Intuit. There's some particular reasons about why it was acquired that I don't think many people really understand. But end of the day, it was a company that was built in less than 3 years, and although it raised about $30 million, it really built in probably less than $10 million. And it was actually a pretty damn good return for many of us who are the early investors. Rob Hayes, sitting here from First Round Capital, was a seed investor, along with Jeff Clavier, Ivan Senket as well. I was in the A round. So depending on whether you're a seed or A round investor, you made probably around 10 to 15 times your money, a little bit, maybe a little bit more than that. Benchmark, who was a later stage investor in the company, maybe didn't make a lot of money, and that's the thing that I kind of want to focus on, right? It's not a great story necessarily for large investors. Benchmark invested, I believe, $12 million in the B round, and the valuation at the time, I think, was around maybe $50 million post-money, slightly less than that. So from their perspective, sounds like a good story, right? Bought in at 50, sold for 170, that's 3x, right? A little bit more than 3x. What's wrong with that? Well, the fact of the matter is Benchmark's running a $500 million fund approximately. I'm not sure the exact numbers. And when they make an investment of $12 million, right, they're not trying to make 3x. They're trying to make 10, 20, 50x, or at least something materially close to the size of their fund, right? Their job for their investors is probably to 3x that fund size over a 10-year period, right? They need to generate $1.5 billion out for their investors to make a $500 million fund work. So turning $12 million into $36 or $48 million in 3 years sounds great, but it's a fucking piece of nothing as far as they're concerned. It's a zip on gnat's ass from their perspective, right? That does not work. It's a waste of time. Now, some people may not want to be telling the story directly, and I don't think Benchmark would necessarily say this, but it probably was not something that they wanted to have happen. They tolerated it for brand, for marketing reasons, for some other story reasons, but it's not on strategy for their fund. In fact, it's a fucking fail. Right? Sorry to say that, but that's the story. Right? They are not going to make a $500 million fund work on 3 exits where the exit size capital is $50 million. That just does not work. You can't get to $1.5 billion in exit value with, $50 million return, unless you're doing like 500 investments. Wait, 500 investments? All right. So, a couple other things. Platform changes. So, we got started a long time ago. The web browser started maybe 15 years ago. Search kicked in maybe 15 years ago, but let's say realistically more the monetization of search and changes 10 years ago. Social platforms and base forums maybe 5 to 7 years ago. Video and other social media platforms 3 to 5 years ago, maybe this kind of drugs a little bit more than that. And then mobile platforms, in my opinion, unless you're talking about SMS,